They say the most ruthless betrayal comes from the one who swore to protect you. When my husband smirked outside the courtroom, whispering that I was just a penniless, unstable woman with a 0% chance of winning, he forgot one core detail. I was the data architect who spent thousands of hours building the brain of his empire, and I always kept the self-destruct source code. This was not a normal divorce. It was a calculated purge. Hello, everyone. Before today's story begins, we'd like to share a quick message. YouTube recently removed our monetization, cutting off our income. If you enjoy this story, we humbly ask for just $1 to help pay our staff so they can make a living and keep creating for you. Thank you for saving us. Now, let's begin the story. My name is Lillian Burns. I am 38 years old. The fluorescent lights of the family court hallway in Austin, Texas, buzzed with a sterile, unforgiving hum. I sat entirely alone on the cold wooden bench, letting the chilled air conditioning wash over my still posture. I was a quiet island in a sea of distressed couples and rushing attorneys. Down the corridor, the heavy oak doors swung open. My husband of 10 years, Marcus Vance, strode in. He carried the polished, untouchable arrogance of a tech startup chief executive officer whose company was supposedly the crown jewel of the city. Trailing closely beside him, projecting an air of calculated ownership, was Chloe. She was his public relations director on paper, and rather transparently, his mistress in reality. Chloe was poured into a razor-sharp designer suit that screamed high-level corporate warfare. She stopped just close enough so her voice would carry over the ambient chatter, ensuring I heard every syllable. "It is honestly tragic," she remarked to Marcus, making sure her tone sliced through the space between us. 2 years after the car accident, and she still looks so deteriorated, it is no wonder her mental state never recovered. We really should just get her into a specialized care facility for her own good. I kept my breathing perfectly even, my eyes fixed firmly on the scuffed grain of the floorboard. I refused to give them the reaction they were so desperate to extract. Sterling, Marcus's veteran attack dog of a lawyer, approached my bench. With a dismissive flick of his wrist, he tossed a thick, aggressively stapled divorce settlement onto the empty space beside me. The terms were glaringly simple and ruthlessly cruel. It demanded that I surrender 100% of my equity shares in the company under the legal pretext of limited behavioral capacity. In exchange for surrendering my life's work, it offered me a pitifully cheap alimony sum, barely enough to sustain an independent life for a single year. Marcus stepped closer, a perfectly tailored monument to deceit. He crouched slightly, placing his hands on his knees to meet my eye level. His gaze swam with a sickening, manufactured pity. "Sign it, Lillian," he whispered, his breath carrying the faint scent of expensive mint. "You do not have a single shred of proof. You do not have a dime to your name. And most importantly, you do not have the sound mind to survive a courtroom battle. Take the deal before you lose even this." I did not flinch. I did not shed a single tear. Nor did I offer him the satisfaction of a verbal defense, maintaining an absolute stony silence. I simply stood up as the bailiff called our case. We filed into the imposing courtroom, as Marcus and his legal team busied themselves unpacking briefcases full of fabricated medical timelines and false narratives. I walked straight up to the front desk. With a remarkably steady hand, I slid a thin, unremarkable gray folder across the polished wood toward Judge Harrison's clerk, right before the hearing officially began. The clerk casually passed it up to the bench. Judge Harrison, a woman known for her weary tolerance of endless domestic squabbles, adjusted her glasses and flipped open the cover. It took less than 30 seconds for the shift to occur. The oppressive, routine atmosphere of the courtroom seemed to instantly drop by 10 degrees. The judge's posture stiffened, her spine going rigid against the high back of her leather chair. The chronic exhaustion that usually clouded her face completely vanished, replaced by a terrifying, razor-sharp intensity. Slowly, she lowered the folder, her eyes bypassing me, bypassing Sterling, and pinning Marcus Vance to his chair with the lethal precision of an executioner. Watching Judge Harrison dissect Marcus with her gaze, the meticulously crafted illusion of his empire began to fracture in my mind, pulling me back to the true genesis of Verdant Sync. 8 years ago, the vibrant tech landscape of Silicon Hills was teeming with visionaries. Marcus was not one of them. He was an empty vessel with a silver tongue, an ambitious salesman peddling a hollow pitch deck he barely understood. I was the systems engineer who gave his empty promises a backbone. While he was out buying expensive drinks for venture capitalists, I was locked in our cramped apartment for hundreds of nights, fueled by black coffee and blind loyalty. I wrote every single line of the core algorithm. I built the architecture that made data synchronization flawless across multiple platforms. When the time came to launch, I voluntarily stepped into the shadows. I preferred the quiet hum of the server room to the blinding flash of the press cameras. I let him wear the crown. I let him call himself the sole genius behind the curtain, believing we were building our future together. Everything shattered 2 years ago. The screech of tires, the crushing impact of the commercial truck running a red light, the taste of copper in my mouth. I survived the car crash, but my mind was left deeply fractured. I suffered from debilitating brain fog and a severe, temporary nervous breakdown. Words would lose their meaning halfway through a sentence. The glowing screens of my computer triggered agonizing migraines. For 18 excruciating months, I was effectively paralyzed, forced to step entirely away from the company I had breathed life into. That was when Marcus realized my vulnerability was his greatest opportunity. While I was trapped in my own home, struggling to remember basic passwords and fighting through daily sensory overload, my husband began a systematic, bloodless coup. He methodically purged the corporate records. He pushed out the original engineers who knew my true role, replacing them with compliant sycophants who asked no questions. He ushered Chloe into the executive circle, handing her the public relations portfolio to strictly control the company narrative. One by one, my signatures were forged, overwritten, or omitted from the founding documents. His cruelty was not loud or violent, it was terrifyingly quiet. It was the art of psychological manipulation, refined to a lethal degree. Whenever our friends or the board members asked about my absence, Marcus would lower his voice, adopting the tone of a weary, heartbroken caretaker. "Lillian is struggling terribly," he would whisper at charity dinners, ensuring the echoes reached the right ears. "The accident broke something fundamental inside her. She is wildly paranoid. She mixes up her sedatives. I am doing absolutely everything I can to support her, but she is completely detached from reality." He played the role of the devoted guardian to absolute perfection. At home, he would intentionally move my car keys, hide my prescription bottles, and then sit quietly on the couch, watching me tear the house apart in a frantic panic. "You forgot again, Lillian," he would say softly, placing a warm, condescending hand on my trembling shoulder. "Your mind is just not right anymore. You are imagining things. You need to rest. Let me handle the company. Let me handle everything." He gaslit me so completely that I truly believed I was losing my sanity. I became a ghost haunting my own life, convinced I was a sick, fragile burden who needed his constant supervision. He successfully transformed the narrative of a brilliant co-founder into a tragic cautionary tale of a woman who had lost her grip on reality. But Marcus made one fatal miscalculation. He assumed the brain fog was a permanent eclipse. He did not realize that the fog was slowly lifting, day by day, revealing the sharp, analytical mind he had tried so desperately to bury. The truth did not come from a dramatic confession or a tearful confrontation. It came from the very domain I had mastered: raw data. One evening, while Marcus was away on a supposedly critical business trip to New York, a sudden, piercing surge of mental clarity hit me. I walked down to the basement and dusted off the old backup server I had built years prior. It was a localized hub Marcus did not even know how to unplug, let alone secure. I booted it up. My fingers, trembling slightly at first, soon found their familiar, rapid rhythm across the mechanical keyboard. I routed through the unencrypted local network traffic, effortlessly bypassing the superficial firewalls he had paid an outside firm to install. There, hidden deep within the cache of a seemingly innocuous internal communication protocol. I found the private chat logs. It was a secondary messaging channel Marcus and Chloe used, confident it was entirely off the official corporate grid. I sat in the dim blue light of the basement, reading the systematic dissection of my life. They joked about my slurred speech. They mocked my desperate, crying attempts to recall technical terms during dinner. But the most chilling discovery was not their cruelty. It was their timeline. I scrolled through thousands of words detailing their precise endgame. Marcus had already drafted legal documents to have me declared legally incompetent and involuntarily committed to a long-term psychiatric facility. The trigger date for my institutionalization was set for the exact week Verdant Sync was scheduled to finalize its initial public offering. He was planning to lock me in a padded, locked ward while he rang the opening bell on Wall Street, cashing in on an initial public offering valued at over $1 billion. I stared at the glowing text until my eyes burned dry. The terrified woman who had cried over misplaced keys died in that cold basement. The data architect woke up. I realized in that exact moment that arguing with a master manipulator was a fool's errand. Screaming or confronting him would only prove his meticulously crafted narrative that I was hysterical and unhinged. I needed to let him think he was winning. I needed to let him build his fraudulent house of cards as high as possible, so that when I finally pulled the foundational pillar, the collapse would be absolute and irreversible. The morning after my discovery, I made him his usual black coffee. My hand did not shake when I handed him the mug across the kitchen island. The urge to confront him, to scream until my vocal cords snapped, was a physical, crushing pressure against my ribs. I forced myself to swallow it down along with my toast. I understood with absolute chilling clarity that engaging in a verbal war with a master manipulator would only result in my own destruction. If I confronted Marcus, he would simply twist my words, weaponize my justifiable anger, and use it as further recorded proof of my erratic instability. The justice system does not operate on righteous indignation. Family courts and federal judges do not care about broken hearts or moral victories. They only believe in immutable, undeniable proof. I needed a secure vantage point. I needed access to enterprise-level decryption tools without triggering the security alerts on Marcus's network. To do that, I had to play the part of the recovering, pathetic wife desperate for a small slice of normalcy. I told Marcus I wanted to try working again, just part-time, something low-stress to help my cognitive behavioral therapy. I applied for a mid-level data analyst position at Aegis Data Vanguard. Aegis was a massive private data intelligence contractor specializing in corporate espionage, threat assessment, and security auditing. To Marcus, it sounded like a harmless, tedious desk job shuffling spreadsheets and organizing filing cabinets. He patted my head, kissed my forehead, and told me he was incredibly proud of my little baby steps. He had no idea he had just willingly handed me the access badges to a military-grade digital armory. Behind the heavy biometric security doors of Aegis, I was no longer the fragile, confused spouse. Surrounded by banks of high-powered servers and cooling systems, my mind locked into a state of absolute hyperfocus. I utilized a series of ghost terminals and deep web proxies, masking my digital footprint entirely, to silently probe the outer perimeters of Verdant Sync. What I found waiting in the dark architecture of his network was staggering. The betrayal went so much deeper than stolen credit. My husband was not merely an adulterer trying to steal my intellectual property. He was the architect of a spectacular, federal-level corporate crime. I dug deep into the user engagement metrics, the exact numbers Marcus was using to dazzle Wall Street investors and artificially inflate his impending initial public offering. They were entirely fabricated. Verdant Sync claimed to have 3 million daily active users securely syncing their data. I isolated the traffic packets and traced the origin IP addresses through a maze of virtual private networks. 2.8 million of those accounts were completely synthetic ghosts. Marcus had purchased massive, illegal botnets from overseas servers. He programmed them to mimic human behavior, creating a closed-loop echo chamber of fake accounts interacting with other fake accounts. He was pumping toxic air into a fragile balloon, preparing to sell it to the public market as solid gold. The pulse in my ears grew deafening as I followed the digital trail from the fake user databases down to the foundational financial ledgers. I needed to know how he was funding this massive, sprawling illusion. The bot farms required immense, continuous capital to sustain their server loads. The truth, hidden beneath layers of encrypted banking logs, nearly sent me into physical shock. Marcus had not just stolen the company I built. He had mortgaged my future to pay for his fraud. Without my knowledge, utilizing expertly forged electronic signatures that bypassed standard banking protocols, he had taken out a massive second mortgage on our shared home. But he did not stop there. Sitting in the cold glow of the Aegis monitors, I watched the data flow like black blood from my personal retirement accounts. These were accounts I had diligently, religiously funded since I was 22 years old. Every single dollar, the safety net for my entire existence, had been ruthlessly liquidated. I tracked the outgoing wire transfers, moving with a desperate, frantic speed. The money was not going into Verdant Sync's legitimate operating budget. It was being systematically funneled through a labyrinth of dummy corporations. I cracked the ownership records of those shell companies one by one. Every single one of them was registered under Chloe's maiden name, heavily shielded in offshore tax havens. They were bleeding me dry to fund the fake user metrics and quietly siphoning the excess cash into untraceable accounts. Marcus had engineered the perfect, inescapable financial trap. If the company successfully went public, he and Chloe would vanish with billions in investor capital. If the initial public offering collapsed and the fraud was exposed, the toxic debt was entirely tied to my name. I would be left standing in the ruins, facing millions of dollars in fraudulent loans, completely penniless and facing potential prison time. I needed to extract the ledgers to prove my innocence, but I quickly encountered his final layer of defense. Marcus had employed a crude but highly effective automated deletion protocol on the back-end servers. It was a localized script programmed to completely scrub the shadow financial logs and bot farm server communications every 30 days. It was a digital incinerator, constantly burning the evidence. He was profoundly confident in this system. He believed that even if a forensic accountant stumbled upon a suspicious transaction, the trail would vanish into thin air before they could ever secure a legal subpoena. More importantly, he banked entirely on my supposed mental incompetence. He was absolutely certain that his brain-damaged, heavily medicated wife could never piece together these fragmented digital shards within a strict 30-day window. He thought I was navigating a dense, inescapable fog. He did not know I had built the very compass he was trying to hide. The 30-day countdown was not a barrier, it was a starting gun. The 30-day deletion window Marcus relied on was incredibly tight, but to a systems engineer, it was an eternity. I needed a ghost to slip through his defenses. A standard data extraction protocol would immediately trip the intrusion detection firewalls I had personally designed for Verdant Sync years ago. I knew my own architecture, and I knew exactly where the blind spots were. I spent 3 agonizing, sleepless nights writing a custom Trojan horse algorithm from scratch. I named the program Equus. It was an elegant, invisible piece of code. It did not aggressively break into the system. Instead, it quietly slipped through the front door disguised as a routine, low-level automated server maintenance update. I deployed Equus from my secure, untraceable terminal at Aegis at exactly 2 a.m, 48 hours before Marcus's automated security scrub was scheduled to execute. I held my breath as I watched the data packets initiate. Equus bypassed the outer perimeter flawlessly. It did not just copy the surface-level data, it dug into the bedrock. It silently siphoned the raw, unfiltered source codes, the hidden botnet registries, and the offshore wire transfer receipts. I pulled the entire uncorrupted digital soul of Verdant Sync across the servers, leaving not a single ripple in the network traffic logs. When Marcus's deletion protocol ran 2 days later, it aggressively burned an empty house. I already possessed the master blueprints. However, simply having the raw data was only half the tactical battle. Corporate defense attorneys like Sterling could easily argue that standard printed financial spreadsheets or regular digital files were tampered with, fabricated, or maliciously planted by a bitter spouse. I needed to forge a weapon they could not break, bend, or deny. I bypassed standard legal documentation entirely. Instead, I took the massive mountain of extracted evidence, every fake user protocol, every fraudulent loan signature, every shell company transfer record, and encrypted it into a private, immutable blockchain ledger. Once sealed, the cryptographic chain could not be altered, deleted, or disputed by anyone on Earth, not even by me, to make it a fatal, inescapable blow. I tied the Genesis block of the chain directly to Marcus's exclusive biometric digital signature, the very cryptographic key he used to authorize his billion-dollar venture capital deals. Was now the unbreakable chain linking him directly to the federal fraud. He had inadvertently signed his own digital confession, permanently locking it into a mathematical vault. With his financial crimes secured, I urgently needed to dismantle the carefully constructed narrative of my own insanity. The local medical professionals in Austin were all handpicked by Marcus, fed his calculated lies about my mental deterioration, and paid handsomely by his premium corporate health insurance. I needed an untouchable, unbiased medical baseline. 6 months prior, under the guise of visiting a distant, sick relative, I had flown to a private neurology clinic in an entirely different state. I underwent 3 days of rigorous, intensive cognitive and psychological evaluations by an independent, board-certified specialist who had never heard the name Marcus Vance. The medical results were absolutely definitive. My trauma-induced brain fog had completely dissipated over 1 year ago. My neural pathways were fully restored. I possessed the certified, notarized medical records proving my brain was functioning perfectly in the top 1% of cognitive percentiles. But the out-of-state records revealed something much darker and far more sinister. Marcus claimed I was desperately dependent on heavy sedatives, using it as his primary argument for my incompetence. I had the independent clinic run a comprehensive, deep tissue toxicology screen. My blood was completely clean. I took those laboratory results and cross-referenced them with the pharmacy logs Marcus kept unlocked in his home office. The dates aligned perfectly. My loving, devoted husband had been forging my signature, illegally purchasing potent tranquilizers, and secretly grinding them into my morning coffee to keep the fog rolling in. He was systematically, chemically poisoning his own wife to maintain control. With the trap fully armed on all fronts, I needed an absolute, undeniable fail-safe. If Marcus somehow managed to silence me in that courtroom, or if he successfully bribed his way out, his empire still had to burn to the ground. I drafted a comprehensive, highly classified whistleblower report detailing every single violation of federal securities law. I attached the blockchain decryption keys, the offshore shell company routing numbers, and the proof of the synthetic user bots. I addressed the encrypted file directly to the Enforcement Division of the Securities and Exchange Commission. But I did not click send. Instead, I embedded the email into a dead man's switch, hosted on a secure, autonomous offshore server. I programmed a rigid, uncompromising, automated trigger. The report was set to automatically launch at exactly 5 o'clock in the afternoon on the day of our divorce trial. The only possible way to stop the transmission was if I personally logged into the terminal and entered a highly complex cryptographic cancellation password. If Marcus won the trial, if I was locked away in a psychiatric ward as he planned, the timer would run out. Federal agents would be raiding his corporate headquarters by the next morning. The most agonizing, exhausting part of this silent war was returning to the battlefield of my own living room every single evening. I had to bury the sharp, dangerous architect deep inside my chest and wear the fragile skin of the victim. I forced my hands to tremble violently when I held my dinner plate. I would stare blankly at the television screen, letting my sentences drift off into confused nothingness when Marcus asked me simple, everyday questions. "Marcus, I cannot find my blue sweater," I would whisper, letting my voice crack with manufactured, pathetic panic. "You left it at the dry cleaners 3 days ago. Lillian, "Your mind is slipping again," he would reply, his voice dripping with fake sympathy. I would intentionally knock over framed photographs and dissolve into fabricated, hysterical tears. My daily performance was flawless. Marcus soaked up my perceived weakness like a sponge. His arrogance swelled to blinding, catastrophic proportions. He became so utterly convinced of his absolute superiority and my complete mental decay that he made the most fatal mistake a technology chief executive officer could ever make. He became incredibly lazy. As the court date loomed closer, he was so absolutely certain of his victory that he did not even bother to hire an independent digital forensics firm to audit his internal networks. He never swept his own digital house for ghosts. He simply adjusted his expensive designer tie, looked down at my shaking hands, and genuinely believed the war was already won. The heavy silence of the courtroom was abruptly broken by the booming, theatrical voice of Sterling. Marcus's veteran lawyer paced back and forth across the polished wooden floor, commanding the room with the practiced ease of a man who was used to crushing vulnerable spouses. He was in his element, enthusiastically weaving a tragic narrative about my supposed mental deterioration. I sat perfectly still at my designated table, my hands neatly folded in my lap, playing the role of the heavily medicated, vacant wife they all expected me to be. "Your Honor, it is a heartbreaking reality," Sterling announced, pressing a hand to his chest in a gross display of manufactured sympathy. "For the past 24 months, my client has carried the agonizing burden of a spouse who is entirely disconnected from reality. Mrs. Burns has completely lost the ability to manage her own daily affairs. She requires constant, around-the-clock supervision. Given her severe psychological instability and her complete lack of contribution to the household or the business for the past 2 years, it is only fair and legally sound that the court strip her of all asset control. We respectfully demand that 100% of the equity in Verdant Sink be awarded to Mr. Vance, along with full conservatorship over her remaining personal accounts." Marcus sat next to Sterling, his posture perfectly relaxed. He turned his head slightly to look at me, offering a gentle, sorrowful smile for the benefit of the court reporter. It was the same condescending, victorious smirk he wore in the hallway. He truly believed he was minutes away from walking out of those double doors as a legally unburdened billionaire. Judge Harrison had not looked up a single time during Sterling's 10-minute monologue. She remained hunched over the bench, her eyes meticulously scanning the pages of the thin gray folder I had submitted to the clerk. The entire room assumed she was bored, merely enduring the standard legal theatrics of a messy divorce. They were catastrophically wrong. Sterling opened his mouth to deliver his final, crushing demand, but the sound never materialized. Judge Harrison's hand came down violently, slamming the gray folder flat against the heavy oak wood of her desk. The sharp, explosive crack echoed through the high-ceilinged room like a gunshot, instantly freezing Sterling in his tracks. The judge slowly raised her head. The chronic fatigue was entirely gone from her face, replaced by a terrifying, glacial fury. "Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice dropping to a dangerously low, resonant register that commanded absolute silence. "Your client claims Mrs. Burns lacks cognitive capacity. Then who wrote the core source code your client just testified under oath is his sole property?" Sterling physically recoiled, his professional confidence evaporating in a split second. He stammered, looking frantically down at his prepared notes, entirely unprepared for the question. Marcus blinked rapidly, his arrogant smile freezing into a mask of pure confusion. He leaned over, whispering frantically into his lawyer's ear, undoubtedly assuring him that the folder only contained fabricated psychiatric evaluations or meaningless, desperate scribbles. He could not have been more wrong. Judge Harrison held up the first document from the file, so the entire room could see the official, embossed federal seal. It was not a medical chart. It was a United States Copyright Office registration certificate. "I am holding a legally binding federal copyright certificate for the entire foundational architecture of Verdant Sink," Judge Harrison stated, her eyes locking onto Marcus like laser sights. registered entirely and exclusively under the name Lillian Burns, dated 3 years prior to the incorporation of your company. Furthermore, attached to this certificate is a certified, third-party digital forensics report. It contains a meticulous Internet protocol trace. It details exactly 142 instances where your personal computer accessed Mrs. Burns's localized secure server while she was physically incapacitated in the intensive care unit. It proves, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that you systematically stole her proprietary code. The blood drained from Marcus's face so fast he looked as though he were going to pass out. His meticulously tanned skin turned a sickly, pale gray. He opened his mouth, but only a dry, breathless gasp escaped. His hands, which had been resting confidently on the table, began to tremble violently. But the execution was not over. I watched, my heart beating in a slow, steady rhythm, as the judge mercilessly turned to page 3. If intellectual property theft were not enough, Judge Harrison continued, her voice slicing through the thick tension in the room, let us discuss marital asset liquidation. Mr. Vance, 10 minutes ago you swore under oath that you have managed the household finances with the utmost integrity to protect your ailing wife. She adjusted her glasses, reading directly from the Aegis data extraction logs I had provided. I am looking at a comprehensive list of unauthorized wire transfers originating from Mrs. Burns's personal premarital retirement accounts. The total sum illegally liquidated is $1,200,450.00. The judge paused, letting the massive number hang in the stale air. Then, she shifted her lethal gaze directly to the gallery seating behind Marcus. And miraculously, that exact sum, down to the very last cent, was deposited 72 hours later into 3 separate offshore shell corporations. Corporations registered in the Cayman Islands under the maiden name of your public relations director, sitting right there in the second row. The courtroom erupted into a chaotic murmur. Chloe's flawless, icy corporate facade shattered instantly. Her face flushed a violent, blotchy red. Panic, raw and unfiltered, seized her. She abruptly stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the floorboards. She clutched her expensive designer handbag tightly against her chest, her eyes darting toward the exit like a trapped animal. I am not a party to this divorce, Chloe stammered, her voice shrill and trembling, completely abandoning her polished public relations persona. This is completely ridiculous. I need to make a phone call. I am leaving. She turned and practically sprinted up the center aisle toward the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom. She reached out to push the brass handles, but a massive, uniformed court bailiff smoothly stepped into her path, crossing his arms over his chest to block her exit. Judge Harrison's voice cracked like a whip from the bench. Sit down immediately. Based on the severe federal nature of the financial documents currently sitting on my desk, I instructed court security to lock down this room before we even began proceedings today. Nobody is leaving this jurisdiction. Chloe collapsed into the nearest wooden bench, burying her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent, terrified sobs. The impenetrable alliance they had built was dissolving into dust right in front of my eyes. At the defense table, Marcus completely imploded. The carefully constructed, charming chief executive officer vanished, leaving behind a desperate, terrified fraud, ignoring Sterling's frantic, hissed commands to sit down and shut up. Marcus leaped to his feet. His tailored suit suddenly looked 2 sizes too big as he leaned over the table, sweating profusely. Your Honor, there is a massive misunderstanding, Marcus babbled, his voice cracking, words spilling out of his mouth in a chaotic rush. She is lying. Well, she was a freelance contractor. She gave me verbal permission to move those funds. We had to protect our assets from her medical debts. She told me to do it. She is unstable. She just does not remember giving me the authorization. Sterling buried his face in his hands, knowing his client was committing legal suicide. Judge Harrison leaned forward, resting her elbows on the bench, staring at Marcus with a mixture of absolute disgust and sheer disbelief. Mr. Vance, she said, her tone terrifyingly calm, 10 minutes ago, You swore under oath that you possessed zero knowledge of computer engineering and hired an external, anonymous team to build your software. Now you claim your wife was a contractor who built it. 10 minutes ago, you swore under oath that your wife was entirely incapable of managing her own daily hygiene or remembering her own name. Now you are claiming she possessed the mental acuity to grant you complex verbal authorization for offshore wire transfers to your mistress. Marcus froze, his mouth hanging open, suddenly realizing the catastrophic trap he had just sprung on himself. You are continuously contradicting your own sworn testimony from just 10 minutes prior, Judge Harrison concluded, her gavel raised in the air. You are digging a bottomless pit of perjury right in front of my eyes, Mr. Vance, and I am more than happy to let you keep digging until the federal authorities arrive to take the shovel from your hands. The heavy wooden gavel fell, but it did not finalize a standard divorce. It initiated a criminal teardown. I am suspending this family court proceeding indefinitely, Judge Harrison announced, her voice echoing with absolute finality. I am immediately transferring this entire dossier to the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Securities and Exchange Commission. There is overwhelming evidence of federal securities fraud, wire fraud, and grand larceny. For the first time all morning, I finally spoke. My voice was calm, steady, and completely devoid of the fabricated tremor I had worn like a heavy coat for 2 long years. Your Honor, I said, standing up tall. Before the bailiffs take them into custody, there is one final piece of evidence on the flash drive attached to the back of the folder. If the clerk could display it on the projector. The clerk obliged. A black terminal screen appeared on the large monitor above the jury box, requesting a password. The decryption phrase is Verdant 0, I stated clearly. The screen instantly unlocked, flooding the room with cascading rows of raw data logs. It was a live visual map of the synthetic user network. That is the real Verdant Sync, I explained, looking directly into Marcus's terrified eyes. You claim 3 million active users. 2.8 million of them are automated bots running on foreign servers. Your billion-dollar tech empire is currently valued at exactly $0. Marcus physically folded. He slid down his chair until his knees hit the floor, burying his face in his trembling hands. The phantom empire he had built on my back shattered into digital dust right there in the middle of the courtroom. From the gallery behind him, the betrayal went full circle. Chloe scrambled to her feet, pointing a manicured finger at the man she once thought was her golden ticket. He forced me to open those offshore accounts, she screamed, her voice shrill with panic. I did not know the money was stolen. He manipulated me into doing it. The grand, deceitful alliance they had formed against me dissolved into a pathetic, vicious spectacle of self-preservation. Before the morning was over, the court issued an emergency injunction freezing every single financial asset tied to Marcus's name. More importantly, Judge Harrison signed a preliminary order restoring the legal ownership of the algorithmic patents entirely back to me. I walked out of that courtroom not just as a free woman, but as the sole, undisputed proprietor of my own genius. 4 months later, the suffocating heat of Texas is just a distant memory. I am currently sitting on the balcony of my new apartment in Seattle, bathed in the crisp, cool morning sunlight. I am sipping dark roast coffee, running my fingers through the golden fur of my newly adopted rescue dog, Buster. 3 time zones away, Marcus is sitting in a federal holding cell, waiting for a criminal trial where he is facing 15 years in a federal penitentiary. He does not have a single penny to his name. People often believe that the most satisfying vengeance requires screaming, breaking glass, or destroying the person who hurt you with undeniable, fiery rage. But true, absolute freedom taught me something entirely different. The most flawless revenge is not loud. It is the quiet, surgical application of intellect and silence. It is stepping out of the way, handing your enemies the pen, and watching them write the absolute destruction of their own lives. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. We hope you enjoyed it. As an ad-free channel, your support is what keeps us alive. Please support Zoe Revenge Stories with just $1 via the QR code on the screen, or click the link in the description box or pinned comment. Also, we would love to connect with you. Please leave a comment telling us which city or state you are listening from. Thank you for standing with us, and see you in the next stories.